The heavy glass doors of the riverside branch swung shut behind me with a muffled thud, sealing out the humid afternoon air. I didn't mind the wait. The familiar scent of crisp stationery and high-end floor wax usually felt like a warm embrace, a reminder of the empire I had spent 15 years building. But today, the air felt different, thicker, charged with a static I couldn't quite name. As I stood at the back of the line in my faded gardening jeans and an oversized linen shirt, a young teller with a razor-sharp bob and a name tag that read Kayla narrowed her eyes at me. When I finally reached her window and pushed a thick, cream-colored envelope across the counter, her lip curled in a sneer that didn't belong in a service industry. "I'd like to deposit this into my personal savings, please," I said, offering a tired but polite smile. Kayla didn't open the envelope. She poked it with the tip of a manicured finger as if it were a biohazard. "And where exactly did a woman like you get $50,000 in cash?" The question was a slap in the face, but before I could find my voice, a familiar shrill laugh pierced the lobby. I turned to see my mother-in-law, Martha, marching toward the counter, her designer handbag swinging like a medieval flail. "She didn't get it honestly, I can tell you that," Martha shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble pillars. "Officer, over here! This woman is trying to deposit stolen funds. I saw her taking it from my son's private safe this morning." The click of handcuffs a moment later was a sound I never expected to hear, especially not while standing in the lobby of the very institution where I held the title of Chief Executive Officer. 6 months ago, my life had been a symphony of quiet successes and morning rituals that tasted of hazelnut coffee and false security. My husband Mark was the kind of man who still brought me wildflowers he'd picked from the edge of our driveway. We lived in a sprawling, historic Victorian on the outskirts of the city, a house I had purchased with my own bonuses long before we wed, though I had always referred to it as ours. I loved the way the morning light hit the stained glass windows in the foyer, casting dancing patterns of ruby and gold across the hardwood floors. "You work too hard, Elle," Mark would say, wrapping his arms around my waist as I checked my emails at the kitchen island. He smelled of cedarwood and expensive drafting paper. As a struggling architect, he had the soul of an artist, or so I told myself. I handled the heavy lifting of our finances, a fact we rarely discussed to protect his pride. I liked being his provider. I liked the way his eyes lit up when I told him we could afford that month-long trip to Tuscany or the new studio equipment he'd been eyeing. The only shadow in our sun-drenched breakfast nook was his mother, Martha. She lived in the guest cottage at the edge of our property, a temporary arrangement that had lasted 3 years. Martha was a woman built of lace, pearls, and a simmering resentment that I was the one holding the checkbook. To her, I was just a numbers girl who had gotten lucky in the world of finance. She had no idea I was the one who signed the very charters that allowed this bank to operate. I kept my professional life separate from my home life, a boundary I cherished, perhaps to a fault. "Elena, darling," Martha had said just that morning, her eyes raking over my casual attire as I prepared for a rare day off to garden. "I saw a suspicious car in the driveway last night, a black sedan. Are you sure you haven't brought home any work troubles? Mark is so stressed lately, and your little job shouldn't be adding to his burden." "It was just a courier, Martha," I replied, keeping my voice level despite the irritation bubbling in my chest. "And my little job is what keeps the roof over our heads. Mark is stressed because he's a perfectionist, not because of me." She had sniffed, adjusting her silk scarf. "A man needs to feel like the head of the house. You'd do well to remember that. All this secrecy with your accounts. It's unnatural for a wife to hide things from her husband." I hadn't hidden anything. I simply hadn't bragged. Mark knew I was an executive, but he preferred not to know the scale of it. It made him feel small, he said. So I played the part of the successful but relatable wife. I didn't mention the board meetings or the multi-million-dollar acquisitions. I just mentioned the long days at the office. That morning, after Martha left, I had found the envelope in my home office. It was a discretionary bonus,
paid out in cash per an old-fashioned tradition for the founding members of the board, a relic of the bank's history that I loved. I had planned to surprise Mark with it, to tell him that his dream of opening his own firm could finally become a reality. I felt a rush of warmth as I tucked the envelope into my bag.
I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized we were finally, truly set for life. As I walked toward the bank branch, the sun felt warm on my shoulders. I felt powerful, yet humble. I was the ghost in the machine, the woman who kept the gears turning, while the world saw only a quiet wife in denim. I walked through those glass doors with a heart full of hope, never imagining that by the time the sun reached its zenith, I would be treated like a common criminal in my own house of glass and gold. "Just put your hands behind your back, ma'am," the officer said, his voice a low rumble of authority. I looked at Martha, who was leaning against the teller's desk, a look of pure, predatory triumph on her face. Behind her, Kayla the teller was already dialing a number, likely the local news. "Martha, tell them who I am," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Tell them this is a mistake." Martha leaned in, the scent of her cloying rose perfume filling my senses. "I am telling them exactly who you are, Elena. A thief who's been draining my son dry for years. It ends today." The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around my wrists, and for a moment the world went silent. I looked at the security camera in the corner, the one I had authorized the budget for last quarter, and realized with a sickening jolt that this was only the beginning of the nightmare. My husband wasn't here. My phone was in my bag, now being rifled through by a stranger. And the woman who had eaten dinner at my table for 3 years was smiling as they led me away. Looking back, the signs were there, tucked into the creases of our daily routine like thorns hidden in a bouquet of roses. For weeks, the atmosphere in our home had shifted from warm domesticity to a brittle, staged performance. Mark, who usually filled the house with the scratching of his drafting pencils and hummed jazz under his breath, had fallen into a heavy, brooding silence. He began taking client calls in the middle of the night, pacing the length of the veranda, his silhouette sharp and jagged against the moonlight. When I'd ask him if everything was all right, he'd offer a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a thin, paper-gray imitation of the man I loved. "Just a big project, Elle," he'd mutter, his fingers twitching toward his phone. "The stakes are just higher than usual. I don't want to fail you." I had brushed it off as professional anxiety, even when I noticed him lingering by my home office door, his gaze fixed on the biometric safe where I kept my sensitive bank documents. I even caught him once, standing over my laptop in the dark, the blue light of the screen carving deep, unfamiliar shadows into his face. He'd jumped when I entered, claiming he was just looking for a charger. I wanted to believe him so badly that I let the lie sit between us like a third guest at dinner. Then there was Martha. Her subtle jabs had sharpened into razor-edged inquiries about the longevity of my position at the bank. "What would happen to the house if your little career ever stumbled, Elena?" she'd asked over tea, her eyes fixed on the crown molding I'd paid to have hand restored. "A woman in your position, you must have so many enemies. It would be a shame if Mark was left unprotected." At the time, I thought she was just being her usual, insecure self, projecting her fears of poverty onto me. I didn't realize she wasn't asking a question, she was conducting an audit of my life. In the manager's office of the Riverside branch, the quiet signs of the past month suddenly converged into a deafening roar. I was sitting in a hard plastic chair, my hands still cuffed behind me. The officer stood by the door looking bored, while the branch manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, whom I had personally vetted for this position 3 years ago, walked in. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just a disheveled woman in gardening clothes accused of grand larceny by her own distraught mother-in-law.
This is a very serious situation, Henderson said, laying a manila folder on the desk with a heavy thud. Mrs. Miller here claims you've been systematically emptying her son's accounts and that the cash in your bag was stolen from a private family trust. That's a lie, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. My heart was thumping so hard against my ribs, I thought it might crack a bone. That money is mine. I am Elena Vance. I am the CEO of this entire banking group. Check your internal directory. Call the headquarters. Martha let out a sob that sounded more like a bark of laughter. She's delusional. My poor Mark. He told me she'd started having these episodes, imagining she's some high-powered executive to cover up her gambling debts. Officer, look at the documents we found in her desk. Henderson opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward me. My eyes blurred, then snapped into focus.
It was a power of attorney. It was dated 2 weeks ago. It bore my signature, a perfect, chilling replica of my elegant, practiced cursive. The document granted Mark full control over my personal properties, my private savings, and, most devastatingly, authorized the sale of my Victorian home. But it wasn't just my forged signature that stopped my heart. It was the witness signature at the bottom. The ink was dark, confident, and unmistakably Mark's. The room began to tilt. A cold, viscous wave of nausea rolled over me, and for a second the sounds of the office, the ticking clock, the hum of the air conditioner, Martha's feigned whimpering, merged into a single high-pitched whine in my ears. The blood drained from my extremities, leaving my fingers and toes tingling with a terrifying numbness. I felt the ground beneath my feet turn into liquid. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a demolition. "I didn't sign this," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "Mark, he wouldn't. He couldn't." "He already did, dear," Martha sneered, her mask finally slipping. She leaned over the desk, her face inches from mine, and I could smell the sickly sweet scent of her mints. "He's at the house right now with the movers. By the time you get out of the holding cell, there won't even be a spoon left for you to claim. He's finally taking back what's his. You've emasculated him long enough with your secrets and your CEO fantasies." I looked at Mr. Henderson. "Look at the date on that document. I was in London for a board meeting that day. I couldn't have signed it." Henderson looked at the paper, then back at me, his expression softening only slightly into pity. "The document is notarized, ma'am, by a mobile notary who confirmed your identity. If you're claiming forgery, that's a separate legal matter. But right now we have a credible report of theft, and a valid legal instrument that says you have no right to this money." The physical shock finally took hold. My vision narrowed until I was looking through a pinhole. I felt the sweat break out on my forehead, cold and clammy. My husband, the man who had held me while I cried when my father died, the man who I had supported and loved and built a life for, had not only stolen my identity, but was currently erasing me from my own home while I sat in handcuffs. "I want to call him," I rasped, my voice breaking. "Call Mark, put him on speaker." Martha smirked, pulling her phone from her bag. "Oh, I think he's a bit busy for you, Elena, but let's see if he picks up for his mother." She dialed, and the ringing sounded like a funeral bell. After 3 agonizing pulses, the line clicked open. "Mom?" Mark's voice was strained, breathless. "Is it done? Is she out of the way?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I stared at the phone on the desk, the man I loved treating me like a piece of trash that needed to be hauled to the curb. My hands, locked in steel, began to shake uncontrollably. I didn't feel like a CEO anymore. I didn't feel like a wife. I felt like a ghost watching her own murder. "Mark," I said, my voice cracking through the silence of the manager's office. "Mark, I'm right here. Tell them you didn't do this. Tell them I didn't sign that paper." On the other end of the line, the sound of heavy breathing was the only response. Then, a muffled scrape of a chair. Mark didn't scream. He didn't deny it. He didn't even sound surprised.
Elena? He finally whispered, his voice devoid of the warmth I had lived for. You weren't supposed to go to the bank today. You said you were going to the garden centre. Is that all you have to say? I shrieked, the tears finally spilling over, hot and bitter. The police are here, Mark. Your mother is calling me a thief. She has a forged power of attorney with your signature on it. It's for the best, Elle, he said, his voice flat, almost robotic. You're not well. Mum's right. The stress of the bank, the way you obsess over the money, it's changed you. We just need to manage things for a while until you get back on your feet. Martha snatched the phone back, a predatory gleam in her eyes. You heard him. Now, officer, surely you've heard enough. This woman is a danger to herself and our family finances. The betrayal was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my lungs that made every breath a struggle. My husband wasn't just a bystander, he was the architect of this cage. But as I looked at Martha's smug face, a cold, sharp clarity began to cut through the fog of my grief. They thought I was a numbers girl. They thought they were dealing with a housewife who had a fancy title. They had no idea who they were actually trying to rob. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice dropping an octave, turning ice cold. I want you to look at me. Not at that forged document, not at this woman.
Look at me. The manager hesitated, his gaze shifting between Martha's expensive silk suit and my dirt-stained jeans. In 30 seconds, I continued, I am going to recite a Level 7 Executive Override Code. It is a sequence of 24 alphanumeric characters that only 3 people in this state possess. If I am delusional, the code will be gibberish. If I am who I say I am, your terminal will lock down and the regional security director will be on this line in under a minute. Do you want to gamble your career on Martha's word? Henderson's face went pale. He hovered his fingers over his keyboard. Martha scoffed, stepping forward. Don't listen to her. She probably overheard some IT person. I barked out the code, a string of digits and letters I had memorized on my first day as CEO. It was the in extremis protocol, designed for kidnappings or corporate ransoms. As the final character left my lips, the computer monitor on Henderson's desk flashed a violent, pulsing red. The office's electronic door lock engaged with a heavy, metallic clack. What did you do? Martha hissed, her confidence wavering for the first time. I just signaled the mothership, Martha, I said, leaning back in the chair, the handcuffs suddenly feeling like a temporary inconvenience rather than a life sentence. And since you've brought the police into my bank, let's make sure they stay for the whole show. 5 minutes later, the door was unlocked from the outside by 2 men in dark suits, the bank's private security detail, followed by a woman in a sharp navy blazer, Sarah, my lead legal counsel. She didn't even look at the police officer. She walked straight to me, her eyes flaring with rage when she saw the cuffs. Unlock her, now, Sarah commanded. The officer, sensing the shift in power, didn't hesitate. The steel rings fell away, leaving red, raw welts on my wrists. Helena, are you all right? Sarah asked, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. I'm not, I said, standing up and rubbing my wrists. But I'm about to be. Martha, meet Sarah. She's the woman who's going to make sure you never even own a toaster again. Martha backed away, her hand flying to her throat. This is a misunderstanding. Mark told me she was stealing. He showed me the accounts. Mark is a coward who couldn't even look me in the eye while he robbed me, I said, stepping toward her. And then came the first twist of the knife. Sarah leaned in and handed me a tablet. While we were tracking your GPS signal to this branch, I had the forensic accountants run a deep dive on the client Mark's been working for. There is no architectural firm, Elena. The client is a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, and the person who owns it? It's not Mark. I looked at the screen. The name on the registration wasn't Martha's either. It was a woman named Chloe Vance, Mark's first wife. The woman he told me had died in a car accident 10 years ago. She's alive? I whispered, the world spinning again. Not only alive,
Sarah said. But she's been living in a penthouse in the city, funded entirely by bonuses Mark has been siphoning from your joint household accounts for 3 years. Martha wasn't just in on it. She's been the one hand-delivering the cash. Martha's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He loved her first. You were just a paycheck. You were supposed to be the easy mark. An easy mark? I repeated, a dark, hollow laugh escaping my throat. You tried to embezzle from a woman who literally oversees the systems you use to hide the money. But then, the second twist hit. Henderson, who had been frantically typing, looked up. Ma'am, Mrs. Vance, there's something else. The power of attorney you mentioned? It wasn't just used for the house. It was used this morning to attempt a transfer of the bank's proprietary encryption keys. Mark wasn't just trying to steal your home. He was trying to sell the bank's security back door to a competitor. My heart went cold. This wasn't just a domestic betrayal. This was a corporate assassination attempt. Mark hadn't just broken my heart. He had tried to burn down everything I had built, likely at the behest of someone much more dangerous than a bitter mother-in-law. Where is he? I asked, my voice a jagged edge. He's still at the house, Sarah said, her face grim. He thinks you're being processed for a felony. He's waiting for the wire transfer to clear so he can leave the country with Chloe. Well, I said, picking up the envelope of $50,000 from the desk. I think it's time I went home. I have a husband to talk to, and a dead wife to meet. I turned to the police officer, who was standing awkwardly by the door. Officer, I believe you were looking for a thief today. I'd suggest you follow my car. I'm about to hand you two on a silver platter. The ride back to the house was the quietest 20 minutes of my life.
I sat in the back of the black executive SUV, staring at the red welts on my wrists where the handcuffs had bitten into my skin. Sarah sat beside me, her fingers flying across a laptop keyboard, making the calls that would dismantle Mark's world before we even reached the driveway. I didn't cry. The tears had been burned away by a cold, surgical fury that felt more like a weapon than an emotion. I wasn't just a woman whose husband had cheated. I was a predator who had been poked in her own den, and I was finally waking up. The wire transfer is flagged and frozen, Elena, Sarah said, her voice low. The moment he tries to confirm the final authorization using your forged credentials, the FBI's cybercrime unit will have a ping on his exact location. Not that he's going anywhere. And the house? I asked. My voice sounded different, hollower, harder. I've already filed an emergency injunction. Any contract signed under that forged power of attorney is null and void. The movers are technically trespassing at this point. I nodded, watching the familiar oak trees of our neighborhood flash by. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were reviewing a balance sheet for a failing subsidiary. Mark wasn't a man anymore. He was a liability that needed to be liquidated. When we pulled into the gravel driveway, the scene was even worse than I'd imagined. A massive yellow moving truck was parked across the lawn, its ramp down like a lolling tongue. Two men were carrying my grandmother's antique mahogany desk, the one I'd used to study for my CPA exams, toward the truck. Mark was standing on the porch, a clipboard in his hand, looking every bit the master of the house. Beside him stood a woman I didn't recognize, though I knew her name now. Chloe. She was blonde, thin, and wearing one of my silk wraps as if she'd owned it her whole life. I stepped out of the car before the driver could even open the door. The police cruiser pulled in behind us, its lights silent, but flashing a rhythmic, accusatory red and blue. Mark's face went through a dizzying series of transformations. Confusion, then annoyance, and finally, a pale, sickly terror as he realized I wasn't in a holding cell. He dropped the clipboard. It clattered down the wooden stairs, the pages fluttering like dying birds. Elena, what are you doing here? There's been a psychiatric intervention, he stammered, his voice climbing an octave. He stepped in front of Chloe, trying to shield her. "You shouldn't be here. You're supposed to be getting help." I walked toward him, my heels clicking on the stone path with the precision of a metronome. I didn't stop until I was at the base of the stairs, looking up at him. The movers stopped, sensing the shift in the air, and set my desk down on the grass. "The only help I'm getting today, Mark, is from the district attorney," I said. I looked past him at the woman on the porch. "And you must be the late Mrs. Vance. You look remarkably well for someone who's been dead for a decade. Is the weather better in the city? Or do you just prefer the penthouse my bonuses have been paying for?" Chloe's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her hand flying to the silk wrap. My wrap. "Mark, you said she was handled," she hissed, her voice like a leaking radiator. Mark looked down at me, his mouth opening and closing. He looked at the police officers stepping out of their car, then at Sarah, who was holding up a digital tablet like a shield. For a long minute he said nothing. He just stared, his shoulders slumping, the facade of the grieving, protective husband evaporating to reveal the small, hollow man underneath. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he finally whispered. It was the moment of silence I had expected, the collapse of a man who realized he had brought a knife to a nuclear standoff. "You have so much, Elle. You have everything. We just wanted a piece of it. You wouldn't even have missed it." I wouldn't have missed my own home? My own identity? I felt the clack of my heart finally locking into place. My rage wasn't hot anymore. It was absolute zero. "You didn't just want a piece, Mark. You wanted to erase me. You wanted to sell the security of thousands of people to fill the pockets of a ghost." I turned to the officer. "He's all yours. The forgery, the embezzlement, and the corporate espionage. I have the digital trail for all of it." As the officers moved up the stairs, Mark didn't fight. He went limp, his eyes fixed on the ground. Martha, who had been brought along in the back of a second police car, was wailing now, a shrill, theatrical sound that no longer had any power over me. I watched them lead my husband, my partner of 10 years, away in the same cold steel that had bound my wrists an hour ago. "The wrap," I said, stopping the officer who was leading Chloe away. She stared at me, trembling. I reached out and firmly untied the silk from her shoulders, pulling it away. "It doesn't suit you. It was a gift from my father, and you don't get to keep anything that belongs to me." 6 months later, the Riverside branch of the bank has a new manager, and Kayla the teller is no longer in the financial industry. I made sure her termination included a permanent blacklisting for breach of ethics. The Victorian house is gone, sold to a lovely young family who will fill it with much better memories than I left behind. I live in a penthouse now, but it's not the one Mark's mistress lived in. Mine is all glass and steel, perched high above the city, overlooking the bank's headquarters. From here, everything is transparent. I don't hide my success anymore. I wear it like armor. Mark is serving 7 years for grand larceny and fraud. Martha is in a managed care facility, paid for by the state since every penny she had was seized as restitution. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I pour myself a glass of wine and look at the red marks on my wrists. They've faded into faint white lines, barely visible unless you're looking for them. I've learned that the most dangerous thing you can do to a woman who built an empire is to assume she's just part of the furniture. They thought I was the vault, something to be cracked and emptied. They forgot that I'm not the vault. I'm the one who owns the keys, the combinations, and the entire building. And in my world, the debt is always paid in full.